As we've been going through the book of Leviticus, we've hit Leviticus 18, which is a hugely controversial chapter in the book. I would argue it's probably the most controversial chapter in the entire book, if not the entire Bible. It's very controversial, especially in the day that we live in today. Because what Leviticus 18 is all about, it's all about sexual regulations. And by the way, throughout the law, what we call the law, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible. Throughout the law, there are different sections that deal with sexuality, but they're like more brief, meaning the regulations are more brief. They'll give one here, one there, and we'll be going to those other sections. But what Leviticus 18 does is it gives us kind of like a framework for what sexuality is supposed to look like in God's community. And these guidelines still apply to us as believers today. In the Messiah. So before we get into, so last week I kind of did just kind of like an overview of what Leviticus 18 is all about. So you guys had a general idea. But I thought what was really cool was after we stopped recording, you guys started asking questions, and those questions were really cool. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, just begin the discussion with, was one of the last questions that was asked, where we were talking about what is right or proper sexuality. So if you go through Leviticus 18, it has a lot of what not to do. So it says, don't do this, don't do that. That's what Leviticus 18 is about. It's prohibitions for your sexuality. But before we could get into prohibitions, you really do got to ask the question of like, what is correct sexuality? And then you can understand why these other things are prohibited, right? So, Bo, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, I would just like kind of have you guys just think about it yourself right now. Like, where do you get your views of, sex and sexuality or sensuality from? Did your parents talk to you about it? Did they have a sit down with you and like, yo, we're going to talk about some sex now? or, hey, man, I'm going to show you what proper sex is, daughter. This is what it looks like. Usually you don't get that. Maybe you have. I don't know. Has anybody here had that? Had any kind of good discussions with their parents? No one's had any kind of good discussion. He's like, oh, no.
Me neither, man. Just so you know, me neither.
Yeah, my kids have had awesome chats, dude. we get down to the nitty gritty. Yeah. Yes, so much where they're like, oh man, Dad, shut up. No, we don't get into it that much, but I'm definitely game. I'm always game for it. But it is tough. It's tough even for a parent. I think in their minds, like if I rolled up all your parents in here, right, and I had them sit down and I said, yo, what's the proper sex? What is proper sex? They're all going to kind of be like, it's going to be kind of a tough question for them too. It's not going to be something that's just easily answered.
Yeah, usually in Christian circles, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, when we talk about sexuality, all I've really heard from Christians is what not to do. I don't know if you guys have ever heard anything different. But if I ask someone, like, what's proper sexuality, they'd probably be like, wait till marriage. Is that a good guideline? Does that really tell you what to do sexually, like how to treat your sexuality? It tells you what not to do, right? That would be like asking your parents, like, how do I drive? And they're like, don't speed, right? Don't cut people off. Don't run reds. Does that teach you how to drive? No, right? See, like when you're in church culture, though, that's all you hear, right? You just hear what not to do. And that's not good guidelines, right? So I think a cool place that me and Bo like to go, we teach on this a lot, Matthew 19. Every wedding that I've done, and all the weddings I've been to that Bo's done, we always tackle Matthew 19 because that's a section of scripture where Jesus is asked about marriage. The specific questions about divorce. And I love how he responds. So if you guys have your Bibles, you can flip there. You don't have to. I'm just going to read it to you. It's Matthew 19, verse 1. It says, now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond Jordan. And a great multitude followed him, and he healed them there. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female. So the first thing I want to point out to you guys is when they ask Jesus about sexuality, Jesus goes immediately to have you not read, right? So where did Jesus find out about what is proper sex? Right? The Bible, right? The Word. And that's what he challenges them with. Have you not read? You know, this kind of surprised me when I first started hanging out with Bo, because I've been going to church my whole life, and I never heard anyone talk about proper sexuality from the scriptures, right? So what it did is it kind of insinuated to me that the Bible didn't have any answers about sexuality. I just kind of thought the Bible had a lot of do's and don'ts, but I didn't think that the Bible actually had guidelines for how to use your sexuality.
How would you guys define, let me give you an easy one. How would you define sex? Okay, intercourse. So but would you say that there's sex that's not intercourse? Yeah. I like how you said it. You're like, yeah. Okay, but you're saying sex is an action, though. I mean, it's something like, I mean, you know it when you see it, right? Right? Do you guys agree with that? You know it when you see it, right? Okay, so we know sex when we see it. So it's an action between people.
Not always.
Or animals, or insects, but it's a part of the. I'd hate to use the word reproductive because it's not always just reproductive, right? But it's something we would agree that it's an action between people. We're talking about human beings, Peter. Right. That is supposed to be pleasurable, but not necessarily either, because there's sexual acts that are not pleasurable that are still considered sexual acts, right? So the reason why I started with an easy one, because as you can see, it's not easy, right? Like we can pull out the dictionary, but even the dictionary's maybe definition of it, we're going to go, oh, that's okay, but you know, there's still more to it, you know. And so if I said, what is sexuality? What is the definition of sexuality? Maybe how one views themselves as a sexual being. Could be something maybe defined as sexuality. How someone perceives themselves, you know, their sexuality. Or how someone maybe utilizes their sexual ability. Could maybe be sexuality too. So in our culture, it's definitely how one views themselves. I would say that's something that's certainly in our culture, right? How you view yourself, your sexual behaviors, you know, something that's a part of that definition. But then if I ask you, what is sensuality? Like, what would you think about that? Sensuality. Being sensual. What do you guys think of that? Is sensuality cool? It's way cool. Sensuality, I always see it as, it's a lot like sexuality, but it's more really integrated with who you are as a person. So it can be the way you dress, or even to the deodorant you wear, or the cologne, or the perfume, or everything that you do that makes you feel as a sexual being. It all relates to you being a sexual being. And it's how you convey your sexuality to another person. To be sensual is something that I always see it as that you're conveying like a sexuality to another. Like, am I sensual with Sylvia? What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean I'm having sex with her. But I'm conveying something to her through an attitude, a behavior, or a way that I'm presenting myself. To me, it would be a real bummer to be in a relationship without any sensuality. And it would be really a bummer to have sex without sensuality. To me, that would be really funny. Even though many people do, don't get me wrong. Millions and millions and millions of people do that. But to me, there's something really fun, with the sensuality part of it all. I mean, pleasure's amazing. I want to have a ton of pleasure. I don't know about you guys, but I like pleasure over pain. And So it's like, hey man, if we're going to do something, let's do it good. You know what I mean? Let's really get into this, you know? So, but the reason why I just bring up those three things is Running Light stresses those three aspects of the totality of us as human beings: sex, sexuality, and sensuality. And I see that the Bible speaks on all those things, but they're not simple things. Very complicated, issues. And so when we say like, hey, do your parents talk to you about stuff like this? Now you're probably like, heck no, not even close, and that's sad, because if I said, does God try to make himself pleasurable looking so that people look at him and go, man, he's awesome? So God is being what? Sensual. Isn't that crazy? See, everything comes from the Bible that I'm talking about. The way he presents himself. Taste and see that I am good. Come eat of my fatness. Is there anyone else like me? Come look at me. Come partake. Right? Everything's like, God's dressing himself up, man. That kind of attitude. It's really interesting. So it's just nothing simple. Everything's a little complicated, and so unfortunately, for some reason in our world, we just people just don't talk about this, and I'm not sure why, per se, but maybe Peter's got a better answer to that. So if you're here and you're going like, wow, there's so much to this. Well, yeah, there is, and we're not going to get it all done tonight or in a month. That's why we're on podcast 82. That's right.
Give us another couple of years, we'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. Maybe.
No, but I was just thinking, like, while you were talking, like, some of the stuff that you're mentioning tonight, like, I remember talking to you for the first time when I was 22 years old, getting back from the military, just coming to you just freaking out because I, struggle with pornography, and I'm like, dude, I don't know what to do, and you're just like, your calm approach to it was so, like, awesome to me. Because what had happened in my life is, because all I'd heard from my sexuality is like, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. Like, I kind of was freaked out about my sexuality. You know what I mean? Like, I took it, like, really seriously. And there's a level where it should be taken seriously, but it was taken seriously to the point where I almost had a framework of mind that excluded fun and pleasure and joy from my sexuality. You guys get that? Where those things just kind of like were separated from me, especially when I incorporated the idea of God, and what that did is it kind of like, in my mind, it broke down all the metaphors in the Bible, because, the Bible uses sexuality as such an intense metaphor for God's love for his people. Intense metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah, can I just give you some just mind-boggling stuff right now that's just going to blow your brain? Okay, in the Old Testament, there's a word, and it's called seed. Onan spilled his seed on the ground. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Okay. Seed is used throughout the Bible over and over and over to talk about the offspring, and to talk specifically about semen. Specifically. That's what it's used for. And then you get in the New Testament, and you know what? You know what John says? Jesus' seed is in you. And you're like, whoa. And if you study the Bible at all, you're going to go, whoa, that's an interesting concept. Why is it used? Why is the word for semen in the Old Testament used in the New Testament for Jesus being in you? Yeah. Right? Why couldn't he said something else? Why is it got to be that? And this is just one example. I can go on for a whole session on this, but you see how it's interesting that the Bible doesn't seem to shy away from this. It doesn't seem to go, oh no, we don't want to talk about this. it seems to actually, God seems to like go into it more. He seems to press into it even greater. So as it's kind of odd, right? So as the church kind of goes, oh, we're going to back away from this topic, God just goes, no, man, I am literally in you. I am literally with you. And I am upon you. What? Adam is in Eve. He is with Eve. And he is upon Eve. And Abraham's with Sarah, and he's in Sarah, and he's upon Sarah. Right? These are all relational words that are used throughout the Old Testament to describe people in their intimate behaviors.
And while you were saying that, it reminded me of Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is this, most Christians have heard it. Most Christians have heard it. We talk about it often. It's the one where it says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him. By his stripes we are healed. Like, very famous passage. But most pastors stop around, verse 7. Right. But listen to keeping in mind what Bo is just talking about with seed and intimacy and sensuality. Listen to verse 9. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Isn't that interesting? It's like
seed and pleasure.
Right.
God's seed is going to produce something, and it's going to be mighty pleasurable. Isn't that interesting? How it just goes over and over and over in Scripture. It's just the whole thing, just over and over and over. This idea. So it's interesting because in our culture, is it okay to do you guys think it's okay to, do you feel in your guys' life, was it okay to talk about these things just in your circles, or no, not really?
For me, and I've told you guys this before, because I realized as a teenager that I enjoyed my sexuality so much, and it seemed like in the church there was really no place for that enjoyment, it kind of caused me to leave the church, meaning that the only friends I could really discuss this stuff with were my friends who didn't know God, or my friends who kind of like were nominal Christians. You guys know what a nominal Christian is, right? Christian only in name. So like they're kind of Christian, but not really. And I would talk to him about this stuff, and it's kind of like what Bo began this topic with, of just like, where did you learn about your sexuality? And for me, it was with my friends, and my friends were not the best source of information, because where did they learn it from? Well, their parents.
Yeah, who knows?
Who knows? Most of us, it was porn. That's the truth. Most of us learned about sensuality, sexuality, and romance from pornography and from movies, like from what you see in movies, magazines, that kind of thing. And
that's natural.
And that's natural. Most people, that's where you're learning from. And, the major point that, I'd like to make to you guys tonight is to really question, is that source really the best source? I mean, it doesn't mean that you can't get good information from talking to your friends or, movies or anything like that. But the question is that, like, is it perfect information? Is it the best guideline for your life and how you utilize your sensuality and your sexuality? Is that really going to be the place where you're gonna really learn what you need to learn to use your sexuality in a way that's beneficial? Because let's face it, as beautiful and as awesome as your sexuality is, it's also the place of your life where you're the most vulnerable. And because of that, it's the place in your life where you could be most severely wounded, right? Most of us have been most severely wounded in our sexuality. That's just kind of how it works because of how cool it is. Like, the greater potential something has for being pleasurable and awesome, the greater potential it has for being harmful and damaging. Right? That's just how it works. And so when we're thinking about it, like what God is trying to show us through his word is that, yes, sensuality, sexuality, sex, it was created and designed by a God who describes himself, by the way, as being a God of pleasure, right? Which means that he designed it for pleasure, for our satisfaction, our joy, and our betterment. But he also gave us guidelines, right? He gave us ways that we're to express these things in a way that is going to be good for us and glorifying for him. Right? And when we stray outside those guidelines, we are putting ourselves in jeopardy, in danger, right? That's not where he wants us to be. So the law, and I've been trying to show you guys this throughout Leviticus, the law was not given to dampen our pleasure. It was given to accelerate it, right? It was actually given to maximize it, because God is trying to show us the best way, the greatest way to utilize these things, right? But that requires a lot of critical thinking on our parts, right, when we're going through these things. Because, as I've told you guys before, the Bible is meditative in nature, meaning that the Bible isn't supposed to have like a book where it's like, oh, just read this book in the Bible and you'll know everything you need to know about sensuality and sex. It's, as we've been talking about, it's peppered throughout the Bible. You're supposed to look through the entire Bible and you're supposed to think about things and how it relates to your life. Right? How it relates to your relationship with God, how it relates to everything else, right? You're supposed to think through these things and meditate on them. And one final thing, and then I'll let you add in. When Bo is talking about the idea of sensuality and fun and ascribing it to God, when I told you guys that, it kind of, in my mind, when I had a negative view of sex from a biblical perspective, it broke down the metaphors in the Bible when it talks about God and his sensuality towards his people. We're obviously not saying that God physically has sex with us or that God physically has a sensuality towards us. We're saying that it's a metaphor to describe God's passion, pleasure, and intimacy that he has with his people. You guys understand that? But when you don't get that, when you don't understand the fun and the joy and the awesomeness that's within your sensuality and your sexuality, what happens is those metaphors are going to be kind of turned in on itself.
Yeah, you're going to look at them all in a negative way, right? You're going to look at it and go, it's gonna,
right?
You know, like I've had these talks with your parents in the big church, you know, and they look at me like, oh my God, really? Like that's really the seed thing? That's really that? You know, and I'm not saying that Jesus' sperm is in me. No, it's a metaphor. They're using an Old Testament word that was used in a certain way, either to talk about specific semen or the offspring of someone, his seed, you know, coming from his loins. You know, those are biblical ways to be nice, to say it's from his fluid, you know, that kind of thing. And it gets picked up on used in a spiritual way. But if you do have the negative view, like a lot of even your parents probably do at times, have more negative views of sex, sexuality, and sensuality, then they won't see the beauty of those metaphors, right? They'll see the metaphor and they'll go, they won't even recognize it, which a lot of people don't. Or if they do recognize it, people have said to me, older people, they're like, why does God do that? Like, why does God use that? Like, I kind of see that kind of nasty. Like, that's kind of yucky. You know, but that's how people view intimacy and sex and sensuality. They see it really negatively.
And so even though they practice it, they don't practice it in a way that they're really thinking like this is meant to be pleasurable, right? This is meant to be enjoyable, or even, and this is really freaky to people, or even in a way that they feel like they can invite God into their sexuality, right? Where they feel like, man, God ought to be present in my sexuality.
Yeah, so I'm going to pray about it. I'm going to bring God into it. Like, you know, God, you know all my members. And usually we go eyes, ears, mouth, and we think of that, and we kind of stop, right, kind of like at that area.
Maybe go down to the feet.
Maybe we skip over, because we've been told when we were little, hey, don't talk about that part, or don't touch yourself there. Or there's all kinds of things that we've been told when we were kids that, education that constantly happens that, we don't talk about those things. Those are privates. And, and there's a place for that. But thing is if it's not balanced out with the idea of presenting your members, it says in the book of Romans, right, as instruments of righteousness, right? And Paul says, present your members. And he says there's parts of your body there's members of your body that are not seen, but it doesn't mean they're not important. He says they're very important. So it's like, but if you don't a lot of people just in their brains, they just check out of their sexual reproductive parts because they have such a negative view of these things. They might go, the world's full of porn, and porn is so yucky, and da-da-da, and they have these bad attitudes. And I've always told Peter, like, porn is sex, dude. Porn is sex. That's all it is. Are you freaked out by that? Like, there's nothing weird about sex. It's just sex, man. Why are you so hung up on this thing? Right? People come to us all the time like, man, porn. Man, I'm struggling with porn. Porn sucks. And then they get into this porn sucks thing. Porn this, porn that, porn, anti-porn. And it's like, but thing is what happens is when you guys, you guys are younger generation. Porn is just sex, man. That's all it is. You go on any kind of porn site and it's people having sex. And if you have a negative view of porn, then guess what starts happening in your mind? You start having a negative view of what? Sex. It's easy to start getting there. Where you just go, man, I don't want to view porn. Porn's bad, porn's bad, porn's bad. Sex is bad. And you get into those habits. If you don't, and that can easily go those directions if you don't understand these things, biblically speaking, about the positives. I'm not saying viewing porn's great. What we're saying is that there's much better things to view than porn, and to get your ideas about sex, sexuality, and sensuality. But I am saying that a lot of people in this world have a very negative view of the reproductive system because of the overabundance of things like pornography, where they just have an incredible negative view of this stuff, where it seeps in to just the idea of sex, where sex becomes synonymous with porn in their mind. So it's very hard for them to think, oh man, sex pleasurable, awesome. God, we're going to bring you in. Before we have sex, we're going to pray. And during sex, I'm going to pray too. And after sex, man, I'm going to think of God as well. So me and Peter, one time, we had a time with a counselor, remember?
I do.
And we're sitting there and I'm kind of sharing this with the counselor. I'm like, yeah, I like pray before, during, and after. And she's looking at me like I'm nuts. She's like, well, that's weird. Really? Like, how can you be aroused thinking about God and being intimate? And I'm like, that's sad, man. I kind of thought that was a sad statement.
I know.
Kind of a bummer. It's like, why? That's a bummer, right? We can't even bring God into this thing. And Christian counselors, think this is weird. Like, why can't we bring God into this beautiful action?
Right. I think of 1 Timothy 4, verse 4, where Paul says, all the creation is good and it is made to be enjoyed when it is set apart by the word of God and by prayer. And so I think of it that way, like when we pray before we eat, we're not praying that somehow by entering into intimacy with God, your hunger goes away. You guys get that right? Like God isn't directly satisfying my hunger, my appetite. I'm praying because as I'm satisfying my appetite with the food that God made, I'm enjoying the Creator in his creation. You guys understand that? And that's what it means to pray when you're in intimacy. What you're doing is you're thinking like, man, like God is amazing. Like he created.
He created my wife. He created me. He created us.
Yeah.
You know, why wouldn't you want to be thankful for those things? The whole point of the last 15 minutes has been really seeing this as a positive, you know, and, you know, is there any other reasons you guys can think of in your own culture of why maybe you would see sex as a negative? Yeah. Okay, that's good. I'm glad you brought that up, because we're going to get there in this talk. But so it's because the way people have used one of those three. It's the way people have maybe utilized those things towards us, right? I've always thought like, yeah, if the world like if you had no sin, if everybody could love perfectly, then guess what? Maybe we would all be naked. Adam and Eve were naked. You know, a lot of us think of like that and we go, ugh, that's kind of weird. You know, but just the thought of thinking that is weird might be the oddity to God. That might be weird, meaning God might think we're weird because we think that's weird, you know? Because to God, in his initial creation, he created him with no clothes. He didn't create him clothed and said, this is Adam and Eve, man, they got some cool Levi's on, you know? And they got their Vans, and man, they're jamming. Dude, they were buck, you know? And they were happy as clams, you know? They were, so something. I bring that up just as a little caveat for our future discussions, that Genesis 3, because what you're talking about is like molestation. You know, I went through things when I was young where I had no clue what the heck someone was doing to me. It sure felt good, but I had no clue what was happening to me. But a lot of men go through that. A lot of men now more than ever are starting to confess their own, like that being molested, because usually it was a very shameful thing for a man to even come close to coming out and saying like, hey, I was fondled, or this happened to me. Where we've known for years, though, that many women, that this happens to a large percentage of women worldwide. So there is something with our sexuality, sensuality that's a little off, that's a little skewed, that actually, that's the reason maybe we even have clothes on today. So you touch on some cool stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was just going to say, like, I remember taking sexual education class in 7th grade, and even that was, like, super negative. You know, you think, like, in the secular world, they'd be like, dude, sex is awesome, you know? Because that's what I always heard. Like, well, first of all, like, you know, when I was about to take sex education, I was excited because I was a young, like, perverted kid, and I heard that they passed out condoms and that they showed a live birth. So I was like, dude, that's awesome. And then, like, they passed out condoms and they showed the live birth. I was like, that's not awesome. And then they just talked about STDs the whole time. And they're just like, dude, this is what happened. Unplanned pregnancy is going to ruin your life. And it was like, seriously, 2 hours of just talking, like looking at STD pictures. And I was like, dude, like, I have like even a more negative view of sex than from the church, you know, like it was like crazy. So it's like, I honestly couldn't tell you guys hearing anything positive about sex from any adult figure. It was always from peers. It was always from friends. I don't know if you guys could relate to that, but I don't think I could ever tell you guys an experience where an adult figure told me like, dude, sex is awesome, you know? And even like the shows I watched as a kid, you know, most of the shows that I watched had this like perspective of like, you know, the man's like way into it, but the girl hates it. And, you know, she kind of puts up with it because, you know, it's like what she has to do as the wife, you know, and the man's like trying to get sex from his wife and she doesn't really want to. And he like kind of, it's my birthday, you know, and then they did it. And then like, it's like a bummer for both of them. And I was like, oh gosh, like, I guess this is sex, you know, like, and it just kind of bummed me out. And the weird thing was, is, like I said, porn was like the only place I could go to that showed sex in like a positive light. And so it was kind of weird that
where
I
people at
gravitated
least
there.
were like seemingly having
Yeah,
fun.
they were at least having fun, like at least
Right.
there was like some joy there. And me and Bo talk about this a lot. Like one of the monstrosities that we really don't like about pornography is it takes sex and it rips it out of all of its context. Do you guys get that? Like where it's just sex. There's no relational context. There's no intimate context. There's no sensual context. It's just sex, right? That's it. So yeah, it is just sex, but it is just sex. And that's the bad thing, where it's not teaching you about the context of where sex should be performed and the relationships that it should be held in and how it should be done, right? It's not teaching you any of those things. It's just saying, this is sex.
Yeah, it's more animalistic.
Right, yeah.
In
it's
its approach.
It's just that.
Just like, this is the action.
This is it. Especially now, like when I was a teenager, at least there was like movies. I don't even think there's movies anymore. It's just clips. So it's like at least the movies had like some context where, the context was stupid. It was like, a milkman coming over or whatever. But like at least there was something, like now it's just scenes, sex scene, sex scene, sex scene, sex scene. You can click on them and you can download them and there's no context whatsoever. And it's totally like it's moving us from away from understanding that sex, like, for me and my wife, like our intimacy doesn't begin and end in the bedroom. Do you guys get that, right? Like it permeates, our sensuality like permeates our whole marriage. And it's very beautiful and it's very awesome. There's an amazing context that actually makes our sensuality and sexuality more pleasurable and more amazing, right? But like if I just thought of it as just like, yeah, sex begins and ends at the bedroom, then I think our sex life would kind of suck,
Yeah, it would be more like an animalistic kind of approach where you'd be in a relationship and you really maybe don't get along,
right.
But you guys, have, quote, good intimacy. And we've seen that in the movies, like, well, we don't like each other, but we have good sex, And it's kind of that animalistic kind of idea where the action of sex is separated from the intimate just fun of being in a relationship with someone. See, let me put it to you really bluntly, okay? I can have good sex with a lot of people. I know that's weird coming from a pastor. But anybody could. Sure, why not? You can go and, I guess, I don't know where you'd go in Tucson, but, or you maybe go online or something and find someone and have great, hot, whatever they call it, and that kind of thing. And it separates, it's not about relational things at all, right? It's just about the physical pleasure that you're getting from the sexual acts that you want done to yourself, That's what it is. And what would the world be like if that was what it was about? Because that's sometimes what you get, that's what it's about, right? We've all been to the store and you look at the girls' mags, right? And what do they all say on them? They all say something like that, right? How to have a hot, whatevers. You know what I mean? Everything's like that, man. It's so driven that way. So what does the world look like if we detach those three things, from God and from just the general relationship that we can have with someone, and we just use those terms, sex, sexuality, and sensuality, just in the sack. Have you guys ever kind of done that in your brain? Like, what would the world be like if we just were animals, like Peter's talking about? We just did what animals did and do. Would we be more happier? I guess that's my point. Would we be more stoked as a world? We'd be like, man, this is how we make the world do it. Now you guys are young, and you gotta understand, in the United States that's already been tried. Because we had the sexual revolution in the 60s, where that was the theme. The theme is you can be happy through simply just meeting Joe Blow on the side of the road and going, hey, let's have blank. And he goes, sure. And that's how it was. I mean, if you talk to anybody back in the 60s in the sexual revolution and what was going on in the United States, man, a lot of people having crazy sex. I mean, they didn't know each other, and they were just having sex, and they thought this was going to make them happy. But did it make everything happy? Did the United States convert to it and just go, yeah, let's do this? No, there was a pendulum swing, even in the United States, where all of a sudden people went, nah, I don't think this is working out, man. I'm having to see psychiatrists now and psychologists, and I need counseling, and everybody was having these repercussions. So the point is have you ever thought of your sexuality, or maybe you have thought of your sexuality apart from God? And what we need to do is start seeing it in tune with God in a positive way, in a real positive vibe, with God. And that maybe a lot of the anxiety that we all feel about sexuality is because we pull it away from a real positive view of God. And so we develop these, there's a lot of anxiety. Would you say there's a lot of anxiety when it comes to things of sexuality in our culture? Absolutely, right? Extreme anxiety. So anyway.
I just wanted to say one more thing, and then we'll pray and leave it open for questions. We have
or maybe you guys have some thoughts.
Our thoughts, anything you guys want to share. But the last thing I wanted to point out is that when you really understand this, for me, it was an amazing moment in my relationship with God, because I realized that when all this shame about sex kind of turns inward, and you're looking at these metaphors about God and his people, like I said, it kind of destroys the metaphor, and it takes away its beauty, because the purpose of these metaphors is to show you just how passionate God is about you. How unbelievably intimate he is with you, and how deeply and affectionate he is with his people. And when you start to kind of grab that, when you start to read passages like Ezekiel 16, which shows God looking at his people as if his people is a virgin, and he's coming over, and he's clothing her, and he's doting on her, and he's being intimate with her. And it's like, man, if you don't understand this, you'll read that passage and you'll kind of cringe. You'll be like, ugh, I don't like that. I like to keep God at a comfortable distance. But when you start understanding this, you'll be like, wow, that's very precious. That God comes into my life, and he's intimate with me, and he loves me, and he delights in me, and there's pleasure there in my walk with God. I realize now, when I look back on my relationship with God, there was very little passion in my walk with God, and there was almost no pleasure in my walk with God. And that's a bummer. But once these things started to click in my life, there's so much passion and zeal and intimacy with God that I was missing out on.